As the war in Ukraine enters the third month, Russia's airstrikes have targeted a logistics center of the Ukrainian army near the city of Lviv. The Russian Defense Ministry says a large number of foreign-made arms were stored in the targeted Ukrainian logistics center. The ministry says a repair center for Tochka-U missiles in the city of Dnipro has been also destroyed. Meanwhile, the Pentagon says the first shipments of a new U.S. military aid package have arrived at Ukraine's border. Moscow had warned against unpredictable consequences if Washington continued supplying arms to Kiev. And now the Ukrainian officials say Russian troops have taken control of the town of Kreminna, situated in the eastern Donbass region, where Russian forces have reportedly started a new offensive. The Ukrainian president and local officials say Russia is seeking to destroy Donbass in the large-scale offensive it has begun there.
Russian troops are preparing for an offensive operation in the east of our country. It will begin in the near future. They want to literally finish off and destroy Donbass, destroy everything that once gave glory to this industrial region.
Volodymyr Zelensky once again called for more sanctions on Russia's energy sector. He said the need for an embargo on Russian oil is growing every day. The Ukrainian president said Russia is openly using energy to destabilize Western societies. Moscow has pointed the incriminating finger at European countries, saying their effort to cut dependence on Russian oil and gas would negatively affect the global market. Russia says there is no replacement for its gas in Europe under the current circumstances. Joining us for this special coverage is Frank Emspak, an emeritus professor at the University of Wisconsin from Madison, and also Tony Gosling, investigative journalist from Bristol. Gentlemen, welcome. Frank, if I can start with you. We've got this reportedly new military operation in the eastern Donbass of Ukraine. What's the significance of that, in your opinion? Could it potentially be the start of the end of the war?
Well, I don't know. It depends on what the Russian objectives are. If they are to take the eastern part of the country and also capture the coast, basically, from the eastern part of the country through Odessa, then maybe yes. But their stated objectives have also been political, in the sense that Ukraine would have to agree to some neutrality and not become part of NATO. And I think Ukraine has already agreed to the first one. The other point you made, though, at the end of your broadcast regarding natural gas, I think was very important in this regard. Today, I guess yesterday in Europe, the German unions and industry together said that it would be unacceptable for the German government to announce an embargo on Russian national gas. And that is an amazing statement, given what's happening in terms of the war, in terms of trying to cut Russia out of the world economy. Basically, the two largest political sort of entities in Germany have said that the embargo is unacceptable. And I think that changes the political rush towards escalation, which I believe is a danger to us all and which is certainly increasing.
That's an interesting point. Tony, what's your take on that? And Frank, speaking about Germany and some opposition there to banning Russian gas. So it's not, when you hear the West speaking about, the Western media speaking about the West banning Russia and all of the West is banning Russia, is it all of the West or just limited to the, you know, the English speaking, the recent the UK, the US and Australia, to put it precisely?
Well, look, there's two things to say about this, really. One is the situation on the ground, and I suppose the other is the way it's been interpreted around the world, because different parts of the world are seeing what's going on in Ukraine in very different ways, because that's the way the media are spinning it. It's very difficult to find balanced reporting, because most parts of the world are either on one side or the other. I think it's fair to say that actually you at Press TV and people like Al Jazeera have done a pretty good job in trying to keep some balance on both sides, having debates, that sort of thing. But what we've seen here in London on the British media is really appalling. But in our newspapers and on the television, really what we're getting is only one side, and it really is, it's almost like a full-on propaganda war is going on, almost like it's, say, World War II, the sort of propaganda we would have got in World War II, where it's all very one-sided. But on the ground, and I think, obviously things will be won and lost on the ground. They won't just be, in people's hearts and minds. And so the change in maneuver of tactics by the Russians does seem to, there have been a few important changes in what they've done, because they've succeeded in the first part of their plan, I think, which was basically to separate and break up the Ukrainian army so that it couldn't really communicate and it couldn't move as one against Russia, and to attack on many fronts. And also, of course, their main objective, and this is totally lost in any of the Western coverage, was the liberation of Lugansk and Donetsk, the two breakaway republics. And that's, I think, what you're alluding to when you're talking about the maneuvers in the east of the country, because we now know the Russians have published the leaked documents, and you don't even need the leaked documents. You just need to look at the position of the Ukrainian army when this first started back in February. The Ukrainian army was poised for an attack on Donbass and Lugansk, and it was all over in the east of the country. So the Russians came and they cut it off from the rest of the country. That's what I think, if you're looking at this from a military point of view, it's absolutely clear that the Russians have moved in order to, first of all, to break up that army, which is very much being supported by the NATO countries, and also to stop them taking those two breakaway republics, which have both voted in overwhelming numbers that they don't want to be ruled by Kiev. And so that, I think, is the importance of the whole Russian operation. I'm afraid, maybe in your part of the world it's being well explained, but over here, not at all. Putin is being painted as a madman, and of course he's actually the one who has been, for many months, saying, no, we shouldn't be doing this, and he's finally caved in, and that's why his support is so great in Russia now. It's, above all expectations. And militarily, I think it's a very difficult situation militarily, just as difficult, and probably will take as long as the Russian operations in Syria did.
Tony, let's Frank, bear with me for a moment while we take a look at some social media reactions, and then we'll get back to the military aspects of this. Let's go through these comments. Our first one is from Katarina, who says, for those saying it's wrong for the West to supply Ukraine with heavy arms, let me remind you these simple words. If Russia stops fighting, there'll be no more war. If Ukraine stops fighting, there'll be no more Ukraine. Desmond says, it is becoming clearer to me that the US, with its aggressive regime change tactics, began the civil war in Ukraine that developed into the Russian invasion, not even to mention the threat of NATO expansion into Ukraine. Liana says, Russia needs to denazify Ukraine. The people of the Donbass are asking for independence. With Russia help, Russia help, they will get it. There was no weapon of mass destruction in Iraq. It was a lie. The West is very good at lying. And then we got this last one from Tomatka, who says, my thesis is Biden and the people who decide over him have pushed and pushed NATO into Ukraine to provoke this war. They need this war to distract people from the disaster that the Biden's presidency has turned out to be. Their one and only hope for the midterms, blame it on Putin. Frank, do you agree? The administration of US President Joe Biden has lost popularity. That's reflected in the opinion polls. Is that the goal here? Blame it on Putin and start this whole crisis in Ukraine?
Sure, I think that's true, and I think that the United States is willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, which is a problem here. I think that the complete mobilization of the press in this country and all of the so-called West, the Le Monde Diplomatique did a 6-page, single-spaced several series of articles on the mobilization of the media in ways that are completely at odds with any kind of serious reporting. But I think we need to understand something here. The Russian invasion of the Ukraine shifted the politics in ways that are negative in almost every respect. There is more militarization in Western Europe. The Germans suddenly agreed to increase their military spending. Sweden and Finland are debating whether to join NATO. The whole discussion of climate is pushed to the side. The fossil fuel companies in this country are saying, see, we told you, we want more drilling, we want more this. And the United States fossil fuel companies are saying to the Germans, we can supply the natural gas. And so this is a huge windfall for all the worst aspects of the debate on the climate. And so I think we need to understand that there are some real negative effects here. Yes, Biden may be able to come out as a wartime president, standing up to the Russians, which is a popular thing in this country. That may work. I mean, after all, the sacrifices so-called being asked are fundamentally a rise in the gas prices here. And clearly there are people saying the companies here are responsible for that, not the Russians. But still, Biden has problems because he was unable to get any of his major domestic policy plans through the Congress. And so, he doesn't look so good. So the war in this sense is maybe a life raft, a lifesaver for him in this regard. But I don't think the overall thing is good for us. You have thousands of people killed, the country being destroyed, and it's not clear how this is going to end. What is the deal that's possible? And I think without that clearly in sight, it's going to be very, very hard for everybody to come to a conclusion here.
Right, Frank, just hold that thought for just a moment and bring back Tony. Tony, there's so many aspects of this news item, but just touching on the military aspect, you got the Western weapons supplied to Ukraine that are being reportedly or being destroyed according to Russia. Is that better than if those weapons are used against Russian forces? Because Moscow has warned that against unpredictable, I'm quoting here, consequences if Washington continues supplying arms to Kiev.
Well, look, it's also quite well known that special forces from the NATO countries are in Ukraine. The question is, are they active in, for example, firing anti-ship missiles that sunk the Moskva, the cruiser, last week, the Russian flagship? If the Russians will be investigating this very closely, I'm quite certain. But the fact that you've got this, what the Russians have done is they've basically destroyed the command structure of the Ukrainian army in many ways, and they've stopped its communications and its headquarters. So what's happened is the NATO countries plus their satellites are starting to take over from the Ukrainian army, and so this is becoming a proxy war. And I totally agree. We just heard from our colleague in the US that the US will fight until the last Ukrainian. Well, certainly I would echo that and say NATO will fight until the last Ukrainian. Ukrainians are victims in this. The separation of families, the press ganging of men to fight or potentially to die. And what we've seen is all of the footage.
Okay, Tony, I'm going to have to cut you short, I'm afraid. We've just got a minute left, and I'll just final word to Frank. Frank, you talked about the impasse that we're seeing in Ukraine, which is unfortunate. So when you look at Washington, instead of the United States sending weapons to a conflict zone, that doesn't help. Why doesn't Washington back the negotiations, perhaps push Ukraine to compromise a little bit at the negotiating table, if you can, in 30 seconds?
We don't back them because we didn't want a settlement. We wanted Ukraine in NATO, and we made that clear with the Minsk Accords, and we undermined them. I think there are tremendous negative effects here. Let me just say, I know we have 30 seconds. You have pending huge food problems in all of North Africa and other parts of the world because the grain that usually Ukraine or Russia supplies is not going to be present. And so you have facing us not only the climate issues, but real impoverishment, real famine in parts of the world here. And so there has to be, I think, people of goodwill have to say enough, because if we don't stop the escalation, what is going to happen here is what's happened in every other type of war like this. You have gradual escalation, gradual involvement, and boom, you then have something that is totally out of control. And I think we are moving in that direction. Every day there's an incremental involvement of the United States with training, with weapons. $800 million is suddenly okay in a week, and yet 3 weeks ago you didn't have money for childcare in this country. I just think that this whole thing is operating on many different levels, most of which are negative.
Interesting stuff. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Very interesting points raised there. Let me thank our guests for their contribution. Frank M. Spike, Emeritus Professor at the University of Wisconsin, joining us from Madison, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist from Bristol.